I want to examine the deterioration of Christianity in Europe, but I don't want to start at the beginning or the end. I want to start with an artist forgotten to history, but who had perhaps the greatest influence on the major painters of the 19th and early 20th century, and so makes an enormous contribution to the art movements directly prior to the period before the First World War. The artist is Adolphe Monticelli, who painted scenes familiar to the milieu of France at the time, but in a wholly new way. The paintings are unfinished. They are thickly crusted with paint. They give the impression that perhaps the light that does exist in the painting is not daylight, but rather comes from some nervous wiring or short circuit in the brain. But the colors and the light shine through. The paintings are effectively the dark, moody, romantic, not to mention modern, versions of a previous style of painting from over a century before Monticelli painted. Monticelli made paintings in a style called the Fête Galante, the genre of art belonging to the Rococo movement of the 18th century. In the 18th century, painters like Watteau and Fragonard defined and popularized the Rococo style. Watteau in particular became famous for his large narrative paintings of the Fête Galante, scenes in which men and women in fine dress occupied idyllic landscapes. Painted overtures to love and the courtly ritual attained in its most sincere pastoral form. In the early 19th century, however, Napoleon had conscripted artists such as David to pioneer the propagandistic neoclassical style of painting. After Napoleon's final exile, new artists like Ingres would take David's emphasis on clarity of form to new heights. His figures were as solid and shiny as porcelain, and perhaps as delicate. By the mid-19th century, the neoclassical style had calcified in the academies into sterile mythological scenes. The newly emerging avant-garde had darkened in tone, establishing the new romantic style of painting. Returning to the Baroque's dimly lit, moody spaces, painters like Delacroix paved the way for the new revolutionary anti-academic spirit in painting. The 19th century saw the most diverse array of new styles in painting. Social critiques and spectators such as Millet, Daumier, and Courbet. Painters like Corot and Theodore Rousseau found ways of incorporating the light and air of the Rococo into a budding naturalistic style. Adolphe Monticelli lived nearly his entire life in relative obscurity in the south of France. He was exposed to Rococo painting in the 1840s when the style was regaining popularity in a revival contemporaneous with the new Romantic movement. So, perhaps Monticelli picked up the style in his youth and adhered to it later in his life. The dark scenes of groups of dressed-up actors and actresses recalls the fiery plasmas of a dream turned solid through thick pigment and oil. Monticelli reached back through time to the distant 18th century, before the trauma of the Revolutionary Wars, before industrialization and urbanization swept France, back in time when the provincial landscape of southern Europe still held sway over the emotions and routines of its populace. He was not the last to attempt to rescue Provence from the tides of revolutionary advancement. Monticelli had a profound impact on perhaps the two most influential painters of the late 19th century, Vincent van Gogh and Paul Cézanne. Cézanne would travel to Marseille to visit Monticelli and paint with him, and Van Gogh wrote extensively about the older painter in his letters. Between the two, Van Gogh and Cézanne influenced nearly every modernist painter of the 20th century. Where does that leave Monticelli? Monticelli was, perhaps not purely in style, but in temperament, a romantic at heart. He spoke oddly, using archaic phrases and words which had personal meanings to him, and so were not easily understood by listeners. He liked to confuse people deliberately, playfully. He loved music. A friend of Monticelli's described the inspiration he found in music. Quote, "Music drove him into a frenzy, especially gypsy music. As soon as the bow had left the violin, he went to his room, lighted all the candles he could find, and painted as far into the night as possible." Monticelli's thickly painted fête recall the old ways of constructing a narrative space in a painting, the history paintings of the past, but they are painted with a thoroughly modern hand, one that has witnessed the fallout of one European revolution, and so must grapple with the ideas that threaten to topple social order. Monticelli is asking us, is history a progression? What old ideas from history can we keep around, and what must we let go of? Why did Monticelli paint the fête gallant scenes of Watteau over a century after the older artist's death? In order to answer these questions and understand Monticelli's fascination with the fête gallant of Watteau, let's begin with the artistic and philosophical movements of Watteau's time, the Enlightenment. In art, the Enlightenment's history runs parallel to the emergence of the Rococo art style. The paintings of the 18th century Rococo style that I remember best are the fête gallant scenes painted by Antoine-Jean Watteau. The fête gallant was not only a decorative theme in many paintings of the time of Watteau, but a real activity of which the aristocratic class of France took part. Fête gallant means grand party, celebrating the conventional manner in which courtly men and women engaged in polite, amorous conversation outdoors. At the time, viewers would have considered Watteau's depiction of the fête gallant as illustrations of customary affairs of high-class Parisians. To Watteau, these scenes held courtly gallantry as the transfiguration of love into light itself. Indeed, the free space and time enjoyed by the wealthy and aristocratic people of France had begun a new trend not only of love as light across the European continent, but also the shimmering new light of ideas. The light in Watteau's painting was important to the history of art because at the time it was a new development. Prior to the Rococo style, artists had, for the most part, worked in the darker tone characteristic of the Baroque era. Artists like Caravaggio, Rembrandt, and Rubens created paintings with dark, shadowy backgrounds, generally with a single light source illuminating the focus of their narrative. Rococo painters, on the other hand, used bright backgrounds as an allegory for the budding spirit of the century of New Thought. Philosophers in the salons of Paris and the coffee houses of Britain had begun the process of confronting old religious ideas, desiring to separate the true, concrete ideas from the traditional propositions of metaphysics. Wisdom that Europeans thought to be true since the Middle Ages in the time of Watteau began showing cracks that would eventually lead to a total collapse of the previous systems of thought. David Hume's revolutionary skeptical treatises cast doubt on a priori knowledge, or beliefs given to us by God. A century before, René Descartes had sown the seeds of the new movement in philosophy by forefronting man's responsibility to rely only on the human mind to obtain truth and knowledge. Among Europe's elite, secularism had taken root. But how long would it take before the working classes that could not afford the luxury of the salon, coffee houses, or fête gallant heard the news? How long before these ideas would change the world? Watteau died in 1721, at the early age of 36 or 37. We don't know the specific date, as historical records on the notoriously elusive painter are scarce. 20 years later, when the infant Enlightenment movement had grown in scale and identity, another painter was born, this time in Spain. Francisco Goya grew up in Fuendetodos, a small town near the city of Zaragoza. The windswept desert mountains around the city would make their way later into the dreamlike barren hills of the backdrops to many of his paintings. Goya began his professional career as an artist working for one of the artistic institutions that the ideas of the Enlightenment would eventually uproot. The Spanish artist worked for the traditional craft founded in the Middle Ages of creating tapestry wall hangings displayed in Spain's royal estates and manors. The paintings that he created as templates for the royal tapestry industry to weave are great masterpieces. The tapestries themselves are not. Goya could perhaps foresee that the manufacture of tapestries as fine artistic decoration, among other archaic practices, was going out of style among the elite of Spain. To go further, one may say that Goya was an artist prescient in his approach to making art in a world that no longer valued religious scenes or aristocratic customs. Some of the most well-known works by Goya today were not appreciated in their time, such as his series of prints, the Caprichos, or his masterpiece, the 3rd of May. His work anticipated a time when art would be judged by broad populations, rather than a small group of wealthy elite with aristocratic tastes. The tapestry paintings have an air of darkness, a nightmarish quality. Although they were painted depicting lower-class Spanish citizens to amuse their wealthy patrons, there is something disturbing that makes its way into the painting. Perhaps, in a way, Goya could not help but mock the aristocracy. He had always felt himself an outsider in the world of the wealthy and elite. But Goya did not refrain from casting a critical eye over the peasant folk of Spain. In the Caprichos, he calls attention to the follies or caprices of the people of his home country, and showed that in the midst of the Great Enlightenment, Spain at its core still held a strong belief in the darkly supernatural. In France, in the 1780s, the national debt had led to crippling taxation of the peasantry and bourgeoisie and massive inflation of the French currency. People everywhere were starving, and soon the pressure reached its climax. With the coming of the French Revolution in 1789, the political and cultural landscape of Europe changed dramatically. The new tenets of reason were synonymous with the shift to a democratic view of human agency. The rules that were to govern society, once the kings and dictators of old were eventually deposed, found their origin in human will, observation, and accord, rather than in the holy books and tablets of an almighty and unseen God. When the National Assembly took power away from the king in France, French citizens began the harrowing process of proving to themselves and the rest of Europe that a secularized state could function just as well, if not better, than a feudal monarchy. Later, when revolutionary France began winning military victories against coalition upon coalition of the entirety of Europe at once, it was clear that the new revolutionary spirit had not only proven itself on the world stage, but shown that the new enlightened ideals of reason were a model that the rest of the world must heed, or else submit to French overlordship. The key point of the revolution in France was that it was not only a political overhaul, but a development fueled by a cultural phenomenon. The people of France now controlled the nation, rather than the clergy, nobility, or king. The entirety of the French populace could now fight in the wars for France's sovereignty, rather than a few thousand noblemen, like the Austrians, Prussians, and British. Napoleon said he spent 30,000 men in a month, while the Austrians had 150,000 men fighting in total. The revolution was a movement by the people of France, therefore it held power only inasmuch as it was fervently supported by the people. Reason, therefore, can be said too to succeed only as much as it held popular support. Indeed, the main tenet of the French Revolution was not reason, as it was understood by the Enlightenment theoreticians of the 18th century, as much as it was the people's accession to its leadership. At the end of the 18th century, political rule, as far as it was replaced by reason, was determined by popular demand. How did France's shift in power structure towards wider popular control affect art? The church and the state, which had sponsored the arts for millennia as a means to ensure their support, had ceased to hold sway over the government. Beginning in the 19th century in France, as a rule, the clergy, nobility, and king no longer supported the arts as a means of upholding their political importance to the degree that they had previously. Therefore, artists had to look to the new model of popular demand to sell their paintings on the market. In France, the painter David created propagandistic masterworks in service to the revolution, and then later, as the power structure shifted again, to France's new dictator, Napoleon. On the 2nd of May, 1808, after Napoleon had invaded Spain and placed his brother on the Spanish throne, the people of Madrid rose up against their French occupiers. On the following day, French forces rounded up as many of the rebels as they could find and executed them by firing squad. Francisco Goya depicted the events of the 2nd and 3rd of May in two paintings which, in the turmoil of the resulting Peninsular War, were not exhibited. The 3rd of May shows the French soldiers who have transformed from human beings into rational machines, administering death to the all-too-human Spanish rebels. A lamp carrying the symbol of the Enlightenment's radiance shines on the terrified group of victims. The unstoppable momentum of the revolution had transformed reason from a rallying cry to fight tyranny to a mechanized instrument of woe. In his Disasters of War series of prints, Goya shows a clash between French soldiers and Spanish patriots. The title reads, "With or Without Reason." With or without reason, the result is the same: violence, death, destruction. Although Napoleon would eventually be forced to exit Spain, leaving the native guerrillas victorious, Goya would find little comfort in his later years. He felt the rational glow of the Enlightenment recede, and the dark heart of Spain's superstitious folklore crowd in on him. Deaf and suffering from a mysterious hallucinatory disease, Goya would eventually leave Spain altogether, living out his last days in, of all places, France.
The real question is, do all true lead to Rome?
Yeah, ready? 1, 2, 3.
The Roman. The Roman, when his burning heart was slaked with blood of Rome, threw down the dagger, dared depart in savage grandeur home. Lord Byron. When the forces of a united Europe ousted the great Roman, Napoleon, the restored Bourbon king Louis XVIII gave Jacques-Louis David, Napoleon's court painter, amnesty. However, David, who had seen and painted his way through the First Revolution and then dictatorial coup d'etat, decided that enough was enough. He exiled himself from Paris and settled in Brussels. why not stay? The king had also offered him a position as court painter again under the restored crown. Perhaps David's loyalties still lay with the ousted Napoleon, and he saw the return to the old ways of ruling nations by divine religious right as a step in the wrong direction, a step backwards. Maybe, in order to emulate his greatest subject, he chose to follow him into the legend of his exile. Although the days that David had chronicled were gone, the changes dealt by the French Revolution, and more importantly by the superhero figure that was Napoleon in his time, could not be stopped. The main tenets of the revolution were developed initially as reason, or the rational power of the human mind. However, as the revolution progressed, reason took on a more collective meaning. It was the spirit of revolution that dominated France, and it would be the imaginative reality of Napoleon's story that transformed the spirit of revolution into the spirit of romanticism. The spirit of revolution implied a distinct advancement or a reaction to the notions developed by René Descartes. Spirit implied not only a mind that worked to create distinctions within the observed world, but a personal and unique body whose passions not only drove the artist but connected him with other kindred souls. The body was not separate from the mind, like the philosopher Descartes wrote, but rather made up one single entity which constituted man's individual spirit. After Napoleon, artists would begin painting for a new popular conception of viewership, one that would reflect the desires and dreams of the people themselves. The Romantic artists also generated through poetic engagement the energy they thought people needed to wake to the reality of their feudal imprisonment and call them to action. Romanticism developed alongside the widespread popularization of liberalism. As the century progressed, revolutionaries across Europe would demand liberal constitutions dedicated to the rights of man. However, the zeitgeist of the new movement demanded not only political passion and creative zeal, but also greatness from its individuals. It demanded new Napoleons who would transform the landscape of art, science, politics, and religion into the vision of Arcadia that had gripped the Enlightenment theoreticians. In particular, the 19th century exploded with great artists, each inspired to tread new ground and develop a grand style or purpose for their paintings. The Romantics up until this point depicted the violence of the collision between reason and its opposite, the irrational elements of life, desire, faith, love, sin, that make up human nature. Nature was not, for the Romantics, only an appreciation for the world outside, but also an acknowledgement that the wildness and unpredictability of Mother Earth existed inside the human being as well. Reason and human nature now had to, if not reconcile, at least share the same space and live in peace for the time being. War and revolution had raged for nearly 30 years. In Germany, national political cohesion had existed in the loose confederation of states known as the Holy Roman Empire. During the war, Napoleon had occupied and controlled nearly all of Germany, and after defeating his two main rivals, Prussia and Austria, dismantled the government of the Holy Roman Empire and imposed a new state called the Confederation of the Rhine. The decisiveness with which Napoleon had defeated the German states inspired outrage in its people and created a newfound sense of unity that would eventually contribute to the establishment of the political body of Germany that we know today. The 18th century saw many great German writers, poets, philosophers, and painters. Perhaps the greatest figure of German Romanticism was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose magnum opus was the play Faust. The story comes from a popular German folktale that has been interpreted in the past by Christopher Marlowe in England. In the original story, a scholar makes a deal with one of the devil's henchmen, Mephistopheles. For a period of time, Mephistopheles will use his magic to serve Faust, and in exchange, Faust promises the devil his soul. At the end of Marlowe's play, Faust pleads with God to save him and even attempts to repent, but ultimately he must descend to hell. Goethe worked on his version throughout his life, and his final resolution to the narrative, published after his death, paints a more optimistic picture of Faust. In the end, he redeems his soul and is saved. This is the history of the Enlightenment and Romantic movements in art, told through the Fête Galante, through the neoclassical, and finally in the Romantic history painting of the 18th and 19th centuries. History painting, or large constructed narrative paintings displaying events that had taken place in the real world, was a genre of art that may have begun as early as the Renaissance, but was formulated and popularized from about 1600. After Romanticism, history painting as a genre goes away, or takes on less importance in the public eye. After Romanticism, realism and naturalism took over. The constructed narrative space was rejected by Impressionism, which postulated the importance of the subjective experience of looking. Generally speaking, after 1900, abstraction and the irrationality of movements such as Dada de-emphasized representation altogether.
He was a young, well-educated man who, in the front lines, had aroused the concerns of his superior officers by a recklessness carried to the extremes. Standing on the parapet in the midst of the bombardments, he conducted the grenades flying by with his finger. His explanation for the doctors was as simple as could be. Strange as it may seem, he had never been wounded. The supposed war was only a simulacrum. The make-believe shells could do no harm. The apparent injuries were only makeup, and moreover maintained that the corpses removed from the operating tables were distributed at night around the fake battlefields.
In the 20th century, Europe despaired. The First World War had wiped clean the spiritual illusions of the continent.
One can readily see what one has become. My stay in this place and the sustained attention I paid to what happened there no doubt had a decisive influence on the development of my thought. It was there, although this was hardly common practice at the time, that I was able to try out the investigative procedures of psychoanalysis on patients, notably recording their dreams and free associations, which I then interpreted.
But for the time being, artists of the 1920s and 30s envisioned the fragmentary, elusive, and fundamentally irrational quality of our perception of life. Where does irrationality come from? And also the root of ideology in Europe. Could we look to the French Revolution as the secular starting point, the initial death of God, the death of the king, and so the death of the divine right of kings, God's system of rule on earth? and Napoleon, that Antichrist, who spread the seeds of secularism that would mark Christianity's ultimate end across Europe, not to mention Europe's colonial holdings globally. But can we go back further? What about the American Revolt? What about Cromwell and the English Civil War, the first unholy decapitation? What about the 30 Years' War and Luther? A spiritual revolution? Freedom from serfdom and the resulting movement of peoples to the New World? If we look at the history books, we find that it was a series of painful transformations that incrementally led the West to abandon religion. Paradoxically, or ironically, the death of the Christian God therefore spreads out over the 500 years of proselytizing and converting the whole world, or as much of it as possible, to Christianity. But for the time being, artists of the 1920s and 30s envisioned the fragmentary, elusive, and fundamentally irrational quality of our perception of life. Where does irrationality come from? One could say immediately it comes from God, the celestial world that we cannot grasp with our feeble mirror neurons. Perhaps looking to God as the explanation of irrationality in life may appear antiquated. We might look to nature as a source of will beyond our understanding. But even in nature, some believe that with the right collection of data points, we will map the weather and compute irrationality entirely, eventually. I could, like Freud and the Surrealists, invoke the dark recesses of the unconscious as the wellspring of the unknowable. But the general public's consensus, with scholasticism's rubber stamp, has run Freud out beyond the horizon, out of sight, hopefully out of mind. We can all see plainly now that the ego-id-superego division echoes painfully the Christian conception of the human condition. Freud thought up the id as the devil and the superego as God in order to appeal to a secularized world still hungry for a divine explanation for the social stigma that they still felt. The Surrealists took his ideas and rationally used them in the pursuit of understanding irrationality. Dalí took the baton from his Spanish compatriot Picasso and began showing the world illustrations of a new divinity in subject matter. Surrealism itself emerged at a European crossroad, situated between France's turn from classical reason to a fascination with Freud's unconscious, and Germany's historical inclinations toward those mysteries of the Schwarzwald. The paintings of Max Ernst represents the combinatory cultural and psychic effects of the two major European powers after the First World War, and in the tense moments before the Second. Practitioners of Surrealism used various techniques to access the unconscious, such as recording and documenting their uncensored thoughts, only to observe them later in order to analyze them structurally and to discover the systems at work underneath. Chance encounters with realms outside of thought, the objective world, which Surrealists categorized as the real, became an emblem of the unknowable. The real was constantly at odds with the whim of the internal conscious decision-maker. The realm of clear, rationalistic individual thought, as we had understood it previously, was now totally inadequate at predicting or describing the world as it was experienced. The goal of Surrealism was then to overcome the challenge of the inadequacy of concurrent action in the face of the real, and to emerge in a way of living in conjunction with dreams and other sources outside of the realm of fact, which existed above the real. Surrealists wanted to know the real and bring light to the unconscious restrictions and limitations of the mind. Freud in general has had a heavy influence on contemporary popular philosophy and theory. Surrealism represented the cultural manifestation in the arts of the spontaneous reaction to Freud's theories. Surrealism was the new frontier, the great mystery of life now subject to contact, analysis, experiment, either due to one's authoritative action or else secession of control and therefore passive documentation of chance encounters or synchronicities. In France, Surrealism had a pope, André Breton, whose mission was the confrontation and obliteration of the regime of the mind, which possessed the popular conscience.
I tried with uneven success to explain that we still wanted very much to do away with the old regime of the mind. Essentially and above all, that we restore language's effervescence, as we had done with automatic writing and significance, and counting blindly from the eventual results. 1926. The realm of facts, as we see it, no ambiguity is possible. All of us seek to shift power from the bands, from the hands of the bourgeoisie to those of the proletariat. Meanwhile, it is nonetheless necessary that the experiments of the inner life continue. Do so, of course, without...
The end of the 1930s saw the rise of Germany's dictator. Perhaps Freud would have seen it as the unconscious historical or literary fixation among the Volk of Germany, that is, the story of Faust and Mephistopheles made manifest. Then, global culture dealt with the colossal historical events of World War II and the Holocaust. How could images justify history in the wake of unspeakable disaster? In New York, the 1950s banned objective images. Jackson Pollock's subjective experience now dominated the American imagination. Perhaps a deep and heroic journey to the shallowest pits of one's internal realm would render the root of man's now apparently villainous ways. But the critic spokesperson of the abstract expressionists, Clement Greenberg, thought it better not to end history so soon, and so New York evolved again in the 1960s. Soren Kierkegaard wrote in the 19th century. He was a Christian, or he might say he aspired to be one, and critiqued the Christians of his native Denmark for their lack of commitment to what he saw as the true religious path. He espoused a personal spiritual commitment to and faith in Christ, rather than what he saw as a face value adherence to church teachings, attendance on Sunday, and the general social conformity of many Christians of his time. In his major work, Either Or, he describes two characters, each of whom represent a different approach to life and relationship with God. He gives us the option to choose between them. But the one he hopes you'll choose is the ethical man, who commits his life not merely to contemplation of God, but to living a life dedicated to his principles. The other character in Either Or is the aesthetic man, who holds no true commitment to God, and samples the world's array of spiritualities like a buffet. He is an artist, a poet perhaps, an aesthetician. His life has no meaning beyond satisfying his desire. To me, the aesthetic man is the ideological man, and today the aesthetic approach to life is everywhere, in the soulless array of images bombarding us from innumerable media machines. In his book, Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard holds up the biblical patriarch of the Abrahamic religions as a pinnacle of faith. Abraham's unwavering faith in God brings him beyond the limits of ethics, past reason, to that crucial moment, the sacrifice of his own son. But Kierkegaard's definition of faith implies a leap, a fundamental uncertainty about the existence of God, and the choice to believe anyway. For Kierkegaard, one may have faith despite never having received a sign from God, never witnessing his power. Abraham, on the other hand, did witness acts of God. He didn't just believe in God. He was certain of his potency. Kierkegaard wants us to choose to believe, but it was not a choice for Abraham. It was not faith in God alone that pushed the biblical prophet beyond the edge of reason. Rather, knowing he exists requires Abraham to live by his commandments, regardless of their apparent absurdity. Isaac's perspective reveals God's true intentions. First, the boy witnesses his father's certainty in God's existence. Then, Isaac witnesses his own salvation by divine intervention. Now he, like his father, knows the power of God.